Kit Carson, Part 14. As soon as Fremont arrived, I left General Kearny and joined him. In March 1847, I started for Washington as bearer of dispatches to the War Department. Lieutenant Beale went with me with dispatches for the Navy. During the first 20 days of our journey, I had to lift him on and off his horse. I did not think he could live, but I took as good care of him as possible under the circumstances we were in, and before our arrival in Washington, he was so far recovered as to be able to look out for himself. I was trebly repaid for my care by the kindness and attention given me by his mother while I was in Washington. On the River Gila, we were attacked in the night by Indians who sent a good many arrows into our camp, but without effect. As soon as they commenced firing, I directed the men to hold their pack saddles in front of them and told them not to speak a word so that the Indians could not direct their aim by hearing us, and not to return their fire, but permit them to approach and then use our rifles as clubs. However, they did not approach, for finding they were doing no execution, they departed before morning. We continued our journey, meeting with no further difficulty, and arrived in Washington in June. At St. Louis, I had the honor of an introduction to Colonel Benton, and was invited by him to remain at his home in Washington during my stay there. I accepted his invitation, and during the time I was there, received the very kindest of treatment from him. I remained in Washington some time, receiving from President Polk the appointment of Lieutenant of Rifles in the U.S. Army, and was then ordered back to California as a bearer of dispatches. Lieutenant Beale went with me, but on account of a recurrence of his illness, was compelled to return from St. Louis. At Fort Leavenworth, I was furnished an escort of 50 volunteers, the Comanche Indians being at war. I reached Pawnee Rock without any difficulty and encamped about 300 yards from a company of volunteers en route for New Mexico with a very large train of wagons. Next morning, when the men of this company were leading out their horses to picket them in new grass, they were attacked by a party of Comanches, and 26 horses and all of their cattle were driven off. The cattle took a turn towards our camp, and I was able to recapture them from the Indians. I lost 2 horses through the fault of 2 of my men who had the ropes in their hands and, wishing to fire at the Indians, let them go. The other company lost 26 horses and would have lost all of their cattle if my party had not been there to assist them. They also had 3 men wounded. They were under the command of Lieutenant Mulroney. We continued our march and arrived at Santa Fe without any difficulty. There I parted with my escort, and hiring a new one of 16 men, continued my journey to California. At Muddy Creek, a tributary of the Virgin River, we came upon about 300 Indians who wanted to come into my camp. I refused to admit them, telling them that they had killed 7 Americans the fall before, that they were treacherous characters who could not be trusted, and that I would not allow myself to be deceived by them. I said further that their object was to come to me under the guise of friendship and then to kill my party, and if they did not retire, I would fire on them. I was compelled to fire, and 1 Indian was killed. The others withdrew, and we had no more trouble on the road, except that we ran out of provisions and had to eat 2 of our mules. We arrived at Los Angeles in October, and from there went on to Monterey and delivered the dispatches to Colonel Mason, the officer in command. We had remained there a few days when we were ordered back to Los Angeles. Shortly after our arrival, I was assigned to duty with the Dragoons under the command of Captain Smith. I had passed the greater part of the winter in charge of a detachment of 25 men guarding the Tejon Pass to prohibit the Indians from taking stolen animals through. Since it was the main pass through the mountains, they were compelled to go through it to commit any depredations. In the spring, I was again ordered to Washington as a bearer of dispatches. I reached Grand River without any serious difficulty. The river was high, and I had to raft my party across. In doing so, one of the rafts, on which were 6 rifles and a number of riding and pack saddles, was lost. It was near sundown, and Lieutenant Brewerton, who was with me, and some of the men were on the opposite bank. They were nearly naked and had to remain in that state until morning, when I sent a man over to them with an axe so that they could make another raft. They made one and crossed the river on it, when we continued our march. Some of the men were compelled to ride bareback until we reached Taos. About 50 miles out of Taos, we met several hundred Utah and Apache Indians. They made demonstrations of hostility, and we retired into the brush, where we permitted only a few of them to approach. We told them that if they were friends, they should leave us, as we were in a naked and destitute condition and could give them nothing. When they saw we had nothing, they left us. I moved on about 10 miles, where I met a party of volunteers in pursuit of Apaches. I reached Taos the next day and then went on to Santa Fe, where I found Colonel Newby of the Illinois Volunteers in command. He rendered me all the assistance I required, informing me that the Comanches were still at war and were watching the roads in parties 200 or 300 strong. I selected my 10 best men, and having discharged all the rest, returned to Taos, and from there departed for the States. Keeping north of the Comanche Range, I reached the Bigelow River and tributary of the Platte, and traveled down it to within 25 miles of the South Fork of the Platte. Here I crossed over to the Platte and descended it to Fort Kearny. I then crossed to the Republican Fork, and from thence to Fort Leavenworth, having met with no trouble on the march. From Fort Leavenworth, I went on to Washington and delivered my dispatches. Returning to St. Louis, I remained there a few days and then started for New Mexico, where I arrived in the month of October 1848. When I was on my way to Washington, I was informed by Colonel Newby at Santa Fe that my appointment as lieutenant had not been confirmed by the Senate, and many of my friends advised me to deliver the dispatches to the commanding officer and not take them through. I considered the matter, reaching the conclusion that as I had been chosen as the most competent person to take the dispatches through safely, I would fulfill the duty. If the service I was performing was beneficial to the public, it did not matter to me whether I was enjoying the rank of lieutenant or only the credit of being an experienced mountaineer. I had gained both honor and credit by performing every duty entrusted to my charge, and on no account did I wish to forfeit the good opinion of a majority of my countrymen merely because the Senate of the United States had not deemed it proper to confirm my appointment to an office I had never sought, and one which, if confirmed, I would have to resign at the close of the war. I was with Fremont from 1842 to 1847. I find it impossible to describe the hardships through which we passed, nor am I capable of doing justice to the credit which he deserves, but his services to his country have been left to the judgment of impartial free men, and all agree in saying that they were great, and have redounded to his honor and to that of his country. End of part 14.